Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Holly Brazier Tope, and I am Head of Politics here at Green Alliance. A few days on from the conclusion of COP28, Green Alliance wanted to bring together a panel of experts to talk about what was agreed and assess what it means for UK policy and politics as we head into an election year. On the one hand, the deal coming out of COP has been hailed as fairly momentous. The final agreement text included explicit language on fossil fuel mitigation for the first time in history. There were also commitments to biodiversity and deforestation, giving hope that we might finally start to intermesh nature and climate more closely, rather than treating the two as separate subjects. And there was the historic creation of a loss and damage fund and massive commitments to the expansion of renewables. But it goes without saying that the agreement to come out of COP is far from perfect in a time of acute climate crisis. After initial hopes that the agreement would explicitly commit to the phasing out of fossil fuels, are people right to feel angry that we ended up with a watered down language that we did on fossil fuel phase out? There are also criticisms over fairness, with developed nations not taking their share of responsibility for the transition, and criticisms that small island nations were left out of the deal, and saying they feel as though celebrating the deal is like celebrating flowers on our grave. There is also criticism that climate science has not been reflected in the agreement, despite the global stocktake showing that the 1.5-degree warming limit is close to being breached. Then we look at all of this in the UK context, and with the UK government recently rolling back on climate commitments and standing accused of using net zero as a political dividing line coming up to the next election, we are asking the question as to whether COP28 has done anything to change the UK political landscape, and what does it mean for the battle between political parties ahead of the next election. Some meaty topics to talk about, lots of questions to answer, and we have a stellar lineup of speakers helping us to delve into some of them. I am sorry to say that Matt Toombs, Director for International Climate Finance and Strategy at DESNZ, is no longer able to join us. But I want to welcome the rest of our panel. We've got Alex Scott, Climate Diplomacy and Geopolitics Programme Lead at E3G, Fiona Harvey, Environment Editor at The Guardian, and Sarah Mukherjee, CEO of IEMA. I'm going to invite each panellist to talk for 5 or so minutes, and then we'll go into an internal discussion, and then we'll open out to a wider Q&A. So please do put your questions into the Q&A function on Zoom. If we could come to Alex first, I mean, the deal coming out of COP28 has been hailed as historic, but it is, I think we can all agree, quite far from perfect. I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about what you make of the deal as a whole and what you see the UK's role in the negotiations as, and what it means for climate politics globally.
Sure, very happy to. Thanks for having me join you on the panel today. I mean, definitely COP28 was tasked with bringing about a course correction in climate policy, and it's not done that immediately. It hasn't immediately shifted the policymaking landscape for all countries and businesses, but it has provided some historic answers to 3 of the big questions that were put on the table for COP28. Those 3 questions were, firstly, how to respond to the global stocktake. This is a core part of the Paris Agreement multilateral architecture that's meant to be informing how countries deliver their bottom-up nationally determined contributions rather than having a top-down division of the carbon budget. Every country decides what they want to contribute to solving this climate crisis, and the global stocktake is that critical element of that bottom-up structure that actually brings some global consideration into what countries develop as their nationally determined contributions. So that was the first big question, whether basically that Paris Agreement architecture works. The second big question that was left out of COP27 was the role of fossil fuels in the climate transition, where you'd had 80 countries in COP27 call for a global commitment to phase out fossil fuels, and it didn't even get put onto the negotiating agenda, but was very much so on the negotiating agenda at COP28. And then the third big question was around supporting vulnerable countries to deal with loss and damage from climate change impacts, and whether and how a fund that had been agreed to be set up at COP27 last year, how that would actually be operationalized, and whether anyone would put any money into it, where that money would come from. Starting with that third one, there was a significant success on loss and damage funding. There was a day one agreement to how to operationalize the loss and damage fund, which is historic in that nothing is usually agreed until everything is agreed in this UNFCCC process. So historic to get that finalized on day one. That depended on some pretty significant compromises from climate vulnerable countries. Some compromises from developed countries, but particularly from climate vulnerable countries. And we did see some pledges to fill that fund coming from not just developed countries, also interestingly from the UAE themselves, putting 100 million forward as a pledge to the fund that helped spark a bit of a bidding war between countries. We ended up with a few European countries all wanting to put 100 million with slightly different currencies into the fund, which is progress, but obviously doesn't answer the billions of dollars that are going to be needed to deal with climate impacts. And we don't quite have a process to answer that question of how the fund will be filled in the long term. On fossil fuels, there was, I think we could say, a more historic outcome than might have been expected from a COP that was overseen by the head of an oil company. What we ended up with was a signal in that global stocktake negotiated response that says the world wants to triple renewable energy, double energy efficiency, and transition away from fossil fuels. It comes with some loopholes in that there are also encouragements on countries to consider how to deploy CCS technologies. And there is a big caveat around kind of acknowledging the role of transitional fuels. Overall, it is historic to have the cause of the climate crisis properly acknowledged in a COP decision, but alone it doesn't force any action. And you've seen some reporting, I'm sure Fiona will speak to this, about how the COP president and others have taken and interpreted what's come out. It doesn't immediately force policy change and business decision-making change the next day. That needs to be delivered through the follow-through processes. And that comes to that first big question around how countries would agree to respond to the global stocktake. One of the big prizes that we wanted to get out of COP28 was some guidance to countries on what they need to consider in writing their next nationally determined contributions and reconsidering the climate policy targets they put in place between now and 2030. And there are some decisions in there really positively encouraging countries to align their nationally determined contributions with a 1.5 degree pathway. That is significant in that previously China in particular would push for any references to the Paris Agreement goals to be about well below 2 degrees and pursuing efforts to 1.5 degrees. So there's a little bit of a political shift in there that can be built upon. And there are some processes set up for ongoing dialogues and political level as well as technical level discussions on how countries could actually reflect the global stocktake outcomes in writing their next NDCs, which is, often the thing that you get out of a COP is more process, more space for dialogue. It doesn't sound exciting or impactful, but it is the best way for that multilateral process to encourage action, encourage policy exchange and learning and so on, and create spaces for investment opportunities to be devised and created. So overall, I think we'd say it was maybe a little bit more positive than the worst case scenarios that really seemed to be threatening when we had no agreement from the Transitional Committee on the Loss and Damage Fund, and that was potentially going to be a major holdup to the negotiated outcomes overall. That compromise was reached, but it left some big unanswered questions, particularly around how to finance the transition. We had some interesting stories from Colombia, from Colombia's environment minister. Colombia was very progressive in committing to end oil and gas exploration in a country where that was a significant part of their revenues and their exports. And they're not experiencing a positive reaction to that at the moment. They are having trade deficits and currency challenges as a result of making that very forward-leaning policy commitment. So how to fund the transition and ensure that developing countries who could leapfrog away over fossil fuel exploitation, how they actually do that, how they're supported to do that from the international community, and some big questions around trade measures. This was a big debate in the COP about the unilateral measures that some countries are accused of putting in place, like the carbon border adjustment mechanism, but also the US's IRA policy, which sees a lot of subsidies and domestic content requirements that are seen as a big burden for other countries wanting to build out their green industry. The other big question that's left on the table is how you actually mobilize the scale of funding that's needed for countries to deal with climate impacts, both loss and damage when they hit, but also adapting in advance, building the resilient infrastructure and early warning systems, etc., that are going to help countries and communities deal with climate impacts before they hit. That is left very much unanswered. There are some bright spots. There's a taxation task force launched by France and Kenya outside of the negotiated outcomes that could look at finding different sources of funding that could plenish these funds in the long term. And there's a bit of a bringing together of all of these agendas, pushing for finance architecture reform under a new global financing framework that the UAE launched early in the COP, with some of the big players like Barbados, Kenya, the US and the UK and France, who'd pulled together the Paris summit and pact for people and planet in the middle of the year. Those questions and how you actually get countries to deliver the policy change in their NDCs still very much remain. There are some positive political outcomes from the COP that I think set us up well to answer those questions, like the re-emergence of this high ambition coalition. That was the reason that the fossil fuel outcome was delivered at the COP. You had the European Union and the islands bring together enough of a political force to outweigh the blockers on a clear signal on fossil fuel transitioning away or phase out. And I think you've got Brazil in particular acknowledging their role in hosting the G20 next year, and then COP30 the year after that. And there's a bit of a buzz created around the idea of the troika of presidencies, the UAE with Azerbaijan next year, which is a bit of an unknown quantity for us all, and Brazil working together to deliver these processes to look at how you'd actually enable the policy change as a result of what's come out of the global stocktake. The UK was constructive and helpful, particularly in the negotiating rooms throughout COP, but I'd say that their domestic policy just holds the UK back from being a real leader or driving a lot of these conversations at the international level. So excited to be part of this discussion about what role we really think the UK could play in implementing what we've got out of COP28 and where we really need to go. I'll stop there, Holly. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. A really thorough and interesting summary. I'm not sure many will be feeling entirely positive about your comment that it's more positive than the worst case scenario, but I think that may be accurate to where we are. Next, I'd like to bring in Fiona. I mean, with Sunak spending more time in the air than on the ground in Dubai, and the climate minister being flown back to the UK at the last minute for a vote on the Rwanda deal, how has the government actually come off after this COP, and was it actually a good moment for the Labour Party? Were there, they had quite a strong presence on the ground. Do the public actually care? Will this change anything as we head into a general election period?
Well, it was dismal, really, wasn't it? Rishi Sunak turned up and looked like he couldn't be bothered, really. As you say, he spent more time in the air in his private jet getting there and back than he did actually at COP. And if he made any impression in his meetings, then we don't know about it. We don't know if he even discussed climate, in fact. The Energy Security and Net Zero Secretary, Claire Coutinho, she came briefly at the beginning, nobody saw her. Then she left it to a junior minister, Graham Stewart, so we didn't even have a Secretary of State left there at the end. And Graham Stewart himself, of course, came back for the Rwanda vote, leaving his officials in charge. So, I mean, really, I don't think the British government could have done any more to say we really don't give a toss about this. Labour, by contrast, yes, Keir Starmer went. He spent a few days there, unlike Rishi Sunak. Ed Miliband was there as well, of course, and a couple of other Labour shadow ministers. I should mention as well, actually, that I think in terms of government ministers, apparently there were 11 there during COP28. Well, you wouldn't have known. They didn't talk to the press at all. There were no press conferences. We had off-the-record briefings from officials, which was very helpful, but we had zip from ministers. They didn't put themselves in front of media or in any way that they could be held accountable at all. What effect this will have on the general election, I think, is probably minimal. I mean, I don't think anyone is going to think, you know, in the run up to the general election, I wonder what happened at COP. It's more about what it says, what signals it gives to the UK's partners, or countries that would like to be partners overseas, relationships with other governments, and the kind of message that the UK's actions send. And unfortunately, that's almost entirely negative. The only question that Graham Stewart was asked when he came out of the plenary was, you know, licensing oil and gas, and then let's see how can you square that with signing up to transition away from fossil fuels. Quite reasonably, that is the only question. I don't think that many countries that want to press forward with climate action, such as, for instance, the High Ambition Coalition, I don't think they're going to be impressed by the UK's actions very much. And it does make things difficult if you're trying to send signals to investors overseas. I interviewed the COP president, Sultan Al Jaber, the day after, and sorry. And he told me that that they're going to press ahead with their investments in fossil fuels, in maintaining capacity, and the UK really can, you know, there's no counter argument the UK can make to that when we're vying to max out the North Sea. So, you know, it's really difficult. I don't think there's going to be a very positive impact from this on UK politics. I don't think this government has shown us that in their final year, or whatever percentage of a year it is they have in power, that they're going to do very much more on the climate. There's been some quite good announcements today on CBAM and on energy efficiency in homes and businesses, but that doesn't really make up for the carelessness that was shown about this issue at COP. So really, I think the kind of brightest spot for the UK at COP was really the King, and let's hope that he's going to Azerbaijan.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, well, in this context, I bring in Sarah to talk. So Fiona lays out the lack of leadership that we're seeing, particularly from the government at the moment. on climate, and that inevitably has a huge impact on businesses and industry. So what impact do you think the agreement at COP28, means for industry and business, and what were the most significant announcements in your take? Does fossil fuel language shape the wider regulatory environment, and has it provided enough certainty to businesses to invest in a transition, both in the UK and abroad?
Really good question. Thanks, Holly. And as I suspected, Alex and Fiona gave such a fantastic, comprehensive summary that there isn't a huge amount left for me to say, but I will make a couple of points, and thank you to both my colleagues for their contributions. The first is on loss and damage, and I'd agree with Alex. I mean, we have members in more than 100 countries, and are very lucky to have members in some of the negotiating teams as well across global south and developed countries. And I was really struck by the genuine surprise and delight, unexpected surprise and delight that there was from negotiating teams in the global south, that this had come over the line. I definitely got the impression in the run up to the talks from our members that this was going to be a real line in the sand. I had a conversation with one member of one negotiating team who said, well, what is actually the point of us rocking up to these things every year only to be told, oh, well, the money's coming, but it's coming at some point. There still remains a big question about delivery. I think there's a big concern about how much of this money is actually going to get to delivery on the ground, and also the whole point around the structural inequalities that are still there if you're a young entrepreneur in a global south or a developing world country. Access to finance is often, you're being charged 30% interest rate. It's very difficult to get venture capitalist finance if you're a person of color, if you're from a minoritized or disadvantaged community, wherever you are in the world. And so there's a lot around that, as Alex mentioned, that delivery, the granularity of delivery that really is not, COP's not there. It has never really been brilliant at doing that, stuck to individual countries and their NDCs. In terms of, there is always a kind of, and I think it's Fiona's 17th, it was something like my 14th or 15th COP. There's always this choreography that everybody starts with perhaps unreasonably high expectations. It all falls off a cliff somewhere halfway through the second week, and you get some sort of large compromise by the end of it, which is, apart from a few shining examples, Paris being one of them, that never really feels like it's more than the sum of its parts. But I think it does send a signal to business, to civil society, that there is at least a focus on this annually. And without it, I think we would be in a far worse place, although I absolutely accept that it's painfully slow and not nearly fast enough towards what we need. I think there certainly was a feeling from businesses and negotiators that the opportunity for phase down was there just for a few days, and it feels like a bit of an opportunity lost, although I accept that we have a lexicon there that we haven't used before, but there is an argument to say that's just another way of saying a different thing, like a bit like phase down instead of phase out. But to your point about business, the most inspiring conversations I had were with young people in developing countries who are just doing it, with businesses who are just doing it, and with civil society, third sector not-for-profits who are just doing it and getting on with delivery. So it's almost as if we can't wait for COP to solve this for us. I was interested in, there was a question in the Q&A about this point about demand, and I think that's not wrong. Actually, there's an argument to say that we need to find ways of making demand, encouraging demand, using government tools and regulations in order to make the demand, have the demand there in the first place. I think there is Fiona's absolutely right. There is not, people aren't going to be knocking on doors or putting leaflets through at the next election talking about what happened at COP. And the fragility. I think we have to be really careful. We have a very fragile coalition, which is quite brittle as well. We saw that after the Uxbridge by-election, how that seemed to, for two main political parties, seems to presage a bit of a withdrawal from the green space and climate policy, and that was 500 votes. So it's up to us, if we care about this stuff, to make sure that voters understand it, businesses understand it, which I think those that do, those that don't probably are beginning to realize that things like TCFD, some of the other big financial regulations, are going to be very radical in the way that they have to disclose their finance risk. I was talking to somebody recently who is involved in infrastructure finance, and it's now becoming quite difficult to find finance for big projects, 30-year projects at the back end, because now having to disclose your climate risk for a lot of places, that becomes very uncertain when you're looking at 20 or 30 years time, and that really does concentrate people's minds. So I think if I was going to put my most optimistic hat on, I think that we're far further than we were even 5 or 10 years ago in terms of the business community understanding the acute and strategic risks, particularly around food and farming. One thing we haven't mentioned is the farming accord, where we had hundreds of countries signing up. That was in quite stark contrast to the actual negotiations around agriculture, which were pretty much left in a stalemate. But at least we're recognizing that food and farming is a very large part of this challenge and possible solution. And personally, I think that's where a lot of the running needs to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, to make sure that food systems are sustainable in a very rapidly changing climate, but also aren't making the problem a whole load worse.
Thank you so much. Really interesting take. I mean, you talk about the entire COP process being painfully slow and not fast enough, and I think that's something all of our panelists would agree with from their comments. I would like to invite you all to turn your cameras on so that we can see everybody and just have a bit more of a broader discussion about where this leaves us. So, where does this leave the UNFCCC process? Is it weaker? Is it stronger after COP28? And what are the next steps? Alex, you rightly talk about how this plays into COP29 in Azerbaijan, COP30, which is, the big one in Brazil. What can we take from this, and what progress are we hoping to see before that happens? How does it play into it? I don't know if Alex, you'd like to start.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I mean, I think, Sarah, you're completely right. The COP process is a behemoth and it moves incredibly slowly. It is not solving this climate crisis. Yet at the same time, there has been progress. And the way I think it's worth thinking about it is as the baseline of action that everybody has to take, rather than the vanguard of the action that really needs to be taken. And I think, the credibility of the Paris Agreement was at risk at this COP. This is the first time that we were responding to the global stocktake, the first time that we were really putting this ambition ratchet mechanism into action. And I think it's scraped through, really. I think there's been enough in the outcome that everybody got a little bit of what they wanted. Everybody got to talk about equity or adaptation finance, or avoiding unilateral trade measures that are huge burdens on countries, at least a little bit in every room of the negotiations. And there's something reflected in that global stocktake response. It's 198 paragraphs long. It is not a quick answer to we're really far off track from the Paris Agreement goals. How are we going to respond? It's not a 10-point plan, basically. I think it scraped the Paris Agreement architecture over the line. And I'm hopeful that we've had this commitment from Brazil at the end of the COP. Every country gives their statement, or at least the representatives of the big negotiating groups give their statements after the final gavel has fallen on the deal. And we had Brazil talking up the need to work on the kind of pathway between here and Belém, their COP in COP30. So that commitment from Brazil to pick up that role, I think is hopeful. We also had the US announce that they've made another deal with China, that they're both going to redo their long-term strategies, which is obviously a deal that they'd cooked up before COP, but is a good vote of confidence in the process actually pushing countries to take some policy action. But it's going to depend on us keeping them all accountable to deliver on it and putting some actual milestones in place, particularly around the energy goals that were set in that final global stocktake response. They don't mean anything unless there are deliverables connected to them. And that's something that we need countries to keep workshopping. We need some ambitious vanguard groups to come out with what their own energy transition plans are. I mean, the UK doesn't have an energy transition plan. How are we asking African countries to develop an energy transition plan that leapfrogs fossil fuels? We need some developed countries, to be honest, to take some first steps on how they're actually going to transition their economies. We can't just rely on Colombia to lead the charge.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I wonder if that brings us into another point about, you know, how much can we use COP28 and all COPs as a useful steer on where other countries are in climate-related policy. You know, we're saying one thing at home, but we're trying to project a very different message. But equally, you know, countries like Canada have announced plans to substantially curb methane emissions, bans on venting and flaring, methane reduction technology on beef farms. And there is a deafening silence from the UK on methane, deafening silence from the UK on the impacts of health and climate and what that looks like. So how much do you think the COP process helps us to identify and highlight particular areas of concern, or is it actually not that relevant? I don't know who wants to come back on that. Sarah, yeah.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think listening to Alex, I mean, again, it's back to, I think that, you know, talking to businesses in the way that we do. I mean, I should also say, I mean, we were delighted to see skills and training form. Admittedly, it was something like a paragraph 198 out of 199, but skills and training were in there because obviously this is all magical thinking. If we don't have the skills and training globally to bring any of these frameworks or delivery schedules to light, but this could be a real competitive advantage for the UK. We work with some partners, called corporate partners, training partners, who are building skills and training centres in the UK for their other territories, because we are, in some cases, and I admit, you know, I absolutely take on board Fiona and Alex's voice that this is maybe not the case in a lot of areas now, but we have been in the past a world leader in some of the climate legislation and the frameworks that we've put together, and they see this as being a competitive advantage for the UK. So it would be great if we were able to maintain that competitive advantage by really beginning to think outside the box. To the point about the COP process itself, I should give a shout out for our negotiators, because Alex and Fiona are absolutely right. Certainly the colleagues, the conversations I had, it's certainly the perception is internationally that we are slipping behind in terms of the politics, but our negotiators got all round A stars for being incredible and also for really driving a lot of this stuff, rather like in Montreal last year, driving a lot of this stuff over the line. So I think we're lucky to have the officials that we have in the places that we have.
Fiona, would you agree with that? It's the political messaging is rather different to what's actually happening in terms of policy.
Very much agree with what Sarah's just said about our negotiators and our civil servants, who are absolutely wonderful and a huge asset to the country and to the world in the negotiations, definitely. But I think that, you know, you need to see this in the wider political context, and unfortunately the wider political context is pretty dreadful around the world. We've got, this is an election year in the UK, and you know, the government has made it clear that it's going to attack Labour on its plans for 28 billion pounds of investment in greening the UK's economy and going for green growth and so on. That 28 billion investment is something that's going to be ramped up to, apparently. So even that is not quite as wonderful as it first appeared. But still, it's the primary Tory target, which kind of makes you wonder, well, you know, if that's something that is your key target, from what the opposition's proposing, that you're trying to shoot down, what else have you got to offer? The answer appears to be not very much. So it's rather depressing, actually, that you know, the idea of green growth and you know, low carbon growth, low carbon as an energy, as an engine of growth, is being rubbished by this government, and will be rubbished in the next year as we move towards a general election. Far, far more concerning, of course, is that we have an election in the United States where Donald Trump is looking to make a comeback, and you know, if he succeeds, then you know, there won't be much point in having COPs in many ways for years, and you know, this entire conversation just becomes completely different if that happens, really. So I think, you know, we have to look at that situation with a great deal of care. In Europe, there are European Parliament elections this year as well, and the Greens are not expected to do very well. So we can, you know, there might be arguments over climate policy within the EU, as well within EU member states, that are unhelpful. You know, if this becomes, climate policy becomes something that is the object of attack by right-wing parties, you know, I just think that's a really, as I say, a depressing development. So that's the broader political context that we have to look at here. And, you know, it's really important that we keep presenting the positive case, because if you're not going to have a green economy, green economic growth, green jobs, a shift to a low carbon economy around the world, then what are you going to have? You know, you're going to continue investing in fossil fuels and continue giving massive bonanzas to the fossil fuel companies, such as they've enjoyed over the past couple of years. Well, where does that take us? Well, that takes us, you know, as Antonio Guterres said, that takes us to the gates of hell. So, you know, I think we've got to in an election year in so many countries around the world, we've got to try and sort of ensure that the reality of this, you know, the scientific reality, the economic reality, are presented clearly, so that people, those of us who are fortunate enough to live in democracies, are able to make an informed choice.
Sarah, do you want to come in?
Yeah, you know, I couldn't agree more. And I think, you know, it's very easy to let slip. And those of us who are, you know, as a former journalist myself, I know that, you know, that someone will fill a vacuum if you leave it, if you assume that everybody has got what you've been saying. And it's back to this, you know, very fragile coalition that we feel that we've got, you know, we've got acts of parliament, we've got this, that, and the other that embeds climate change, net zero, into our democracy. But acts of parliament can be repealed, things can be unpicked, you know, or just ignored. There are a lot of people out there who think that climate change is going to make them poorer and colder. And we have, if we really care about this stuff, it's up to us to ensure that we are constantly making the case for a completely reimagined economy that not only reduces carbon and reduces fossil fuels, but also is more democratic. Is that and it's something that's basically a bus, a bus that isn't going to, you're not going to have to take your life in your hands if you've got a couple of kids and you want to go upstairs, or there's somewhere to put the buggy, and also you can have it as a low or zero carbon or carbon negative piece of transport as well. All of those things are a real opportunity to redesign a more equitable society whilst making people warmer and better off, because energy efficiency is an incredibly good way to save money. And this is, a lot of businesses have come to the point of understanding why this is so important, not through necessarily looking at it through the environmental lens, but looking at it through the financial lens. Because if you can save money, or if your investment in energy reduction measures has a very short payback time, which increasingly it does, then that makes all sorts of sense to your CFO as well as your CEO as well. So there's a positive and optimistic message, but it's very easy to have that diluted or upturned or toxified by bad actors.
Absolutely. And I think, as we go towards a general election that we know is going to be fought on the cost of living and what the economic situation is for so many households across the UK, it's so important for us to remember that and look at that, and how we can be messaging, green messages to the country. And I don't know if, Alex, please, people do post your comments in the Q&A. I'll come to them just after this question. But just to bring you in, Alex, there obviously the uncertainty internationally is absolutely vast, and it is due to last for the next year. That is a massive amount of time in what is a critical decade on climate action. And how do we stop the next year being a complete write-off, as businesses don't want to invest? They don't know what is going to come in both the US, the UK, the EU. That it's global. How do we keep people positive and motivated, and make sure that the media are picking up the right stories and pushing things in the right way? We're looking at the 28 billion. How do we make sure Labour keep it and they don't continue to water it down, as many people are speculating they will?
I mean, there's definitely a role for everyone to play as citizens, to be keeping this on the agenda of their MPs, so that it's not politically as viable for them to ignore the questions. I can see some hopeful routes to getting through the uncertainty of the next few massive election cycles. I think we're relying a lot on citizens in the US to not vote a certain way and keep some political energy alive in the global political system. But I think we've also seen a real trend towards more partnership approaches to implementing and changing national climate change policy. You've had things like the Just Energy Transition Partnerships bring multiple finance provider countries together with a recipient country to look at how would you actually help decommission coal-fired power and retrain, and have kind of just transition retraining programs embedded in it. It's not working perfectly at the moment, but there are examples out there. Also on the resilience side of things, one of the big things that was announced at COP was this partnership between France and other finance providers in Bangladesh, which is huge sums of money, $1 billion and $1 billion more in special drawing rights from the IMF, to enable Bangladesh to take out loans to invest in resilient infrastructure development and developing their policy systems, and kind of working with local governments on how to build out resilience. So I think there are some things that we need to have global political signals on that rely on us having the political will in the likes of the US and the European Commission. And it's difficult to see a pathway to land those global political signals with the potential for those elections to go in a climate unambitious way next year. But there are also lots of things that need to happen, even if we got the perfect set of world leaders wanting to push climate ambition in their G7 and G20 and COP final decisions and communiques, it wouldn't cause the change in policy and business action that we'd need to see unless there is a kind of undercurrent of policy exchange, business learning exchange on how to shift business models and find those routes for investment. And what I take hope from is seeing some of those partnership spaces created, even the C40s of the world linking up subnational governments with each other to exchange on how they can implement policy. Not that much is actually controlled by world leaders. They do control the political direction setting. They do control a lot of the investment environment that's created from that political direction setting. But there's a lot that we can invest in on that implementation level to keep the conversations going, keep the policy development and business development going. Thanks.
Just to turn to the chat, I mean, there's a really interesting question on the framing of, the public narrative post-COP and whether panelists think it's time to let go of the increasingly unrealistic, keep 1.5 degrees alive. And if that is now outdated, what should replace it? Should it be about every 0.1 degree mattering? Is it about just stopping whatever we can? Fiona, I don't know if you want to jump in from like a media perspective and how people has 1.5 cut through, is that why it's stuck?
Yeah, I think this is a really important question here because the prospects for 1.5 are really not looking great after this result, because although it was a historic step forward in terms of getting fossil fuels on the in the outcome and so on, and that is really important. It's not substantial enough. There isn't enough in that outcome to actually force reductions in emissions that will take us where we need to go. We're relying on the NDCs that are coming in the next year, 2 years, and we're relying on them being good enough. Now, why should they be when previous NDCs have been so inadequate? Well, we've got to find ways of bringing pressure to bear on the recalcitrant countries, and also we've got to find ways of, as you've mentioned, methane is very important. Short-lived climate pollutants, I think, are absolutely essential now to buy us some time. We've got to focus very, very hard on methane because it's such a big part of the problem. So if we can get some wins like that, that could be really important in trying to keep the envelope for 1.5 open. What I think that we mustn't do is slip over into this kind of sort of doomerism and say, oh, well, 1.5 is out the window now. Because that's just inviting the countries who never really wanted to sign up to 1.5. That's just inviting them to rewrite everything. That's inviting them to go back to kind of pre-Glasgow. Something that I think is not always apparent to COP people who aren't very familiar with COPs is that a lot of countries, like for instance, like-minded developing countries, when they talk about how devoted they are to the Paris Agreement, what they actually mean is that they don't like 1.5, because when they refer to the Paris Agreement, what they mean is 2 degrees. So there's a lot of sort of double speak that goes on at COP that sometimes people don't always decode correctly. So there are a lot of countries out there who would be very happy to, not to have to submit NDCs that were in line with 1.5, who would carry on and submit NDCs in line with 2 degrees. So that's a kind of, it's awful that we have to keep coming back and fighting these same fights usually with the same people, that we don't, the progress that we make, that we think we've made at COPs, is constantly under threat, is constantly being unpicked. So, we just have to keep on with that, and ensure that the NDCs are in line with 1.5 and that they come as quickly as they can.
Yes, I mean, I would absolutely agree with Fiona on that. I think it's once you give up something like 1.5, which has had some cut through. I mean, it's interesting. There were quite a lot of people who, I don't think maybe it was even their first COP. They certainly haven't been, they weren't COP veterans who were wearing their 1.5 badges at COP. I've seen them at other meetings, and okay, we're very good at talking to each other, and lots of rooms where we kind of slap each other on the back and say, "Isn't it marvelous?" But the fact that it's got to badge territory, I think, is probably some sort of sign of success, I guess. Just letting it go and saying, "Oh well, that's banked. That's now banked for more than that." I think, to Fiona's point, I think it sends the wrong signal. I think already we shouldn't underestimate the amount of climate anxiety and climate depression, particularly with people under 35, that there already is. And again, it behoves us, if we're interested in this stuff and really want to try to understand the scale and support people, we have to give, I think, some sort of, there's lots of talk of North Stars in the COP process. I think that if we lose this as a North Star now, that does not send a good message, either for organisations, companies, civil society that actually want to get stuff delivered, but also for many people, particularly many young people out there, and people in minoritized communities who are already feeling very, very worried about this, quite understandably so.
We've got a lot of questions in the chat about political framing more broadly in the UK. And I mean, I'll just condense a few of them if people want to come back. But there's a question on advice to the Labour Party as to what they should say about COP in their manifesto for general election. Seems unlikely it will be there in there at all, I imagine. We're struggling to make sure the words Green Prosperity Plan are still within it. But there are also things about how we best position things like food, land use, agriculture reform in the UK next year, in an election year. We know it's a massive issue, particularly in those more conservative Liberal Democrat constituencies. How do we make sure that it's a positive opportunity led by farmers and society and not a culture war focused on diet shifts and that kind of thing? And then just to bring in one final point, there's a question on like how we often hear in the UK, and we are now hearing from our government as well, that there's no point doing things until China and India do. How can we counter that? And does anything coming out of this COP allow a decent response on a national political level to those more sceptical audiences? Don't know if anyone wants to comment on any of those points.
Shall I? I'll jump in feet first. Why not? First bit. Yeah, I go back to this point about actually making the case not just to the people that we want to talk to. There's a huge amount of swanning about, patting each other on the back, and I'm hands up. I'm just as bad as everybody else in this. If we want to ensure that politicians listen to voters who write to them and focus groups, and unless this is something that people are writing to them about or bearding them at constituency surgeries or is coming up in the focus groups, then it's not going to happen. And at the moment, understandably, people are worried about keeping a roof over their head, making sure their kids are fed, and making sure that they've got enough money to last to the end of the week. There is a narrative, as I think we've all touched on, around that, which is around being warmer, being safer, having more disposable income. They are medium to long-term solutions that get you there, but they are also solutions that get you to a more sustainable global economy, using less stuff, just using less stuff I mean, don't wish to sound like Scrooge here, but using their stuff at Christmas, you know, and all of those sort of things, everyday things that we can, you know, we have the power to give those regular messages to ensure that it becomes part of the narrative rather than just a green thing that gets dumped, you know, in COP every time someone mentions environment stuff. Then suddenly we're talking about it, and then we forget about it. It should be part of a narrative for every single government department.
Alex or Fiona, would you like to come back on any of those points?
Well,
Maybe
I think that, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say quickly, I mean, I think in Ed's question, the answer is also there, working with different sections of society, different groupings to make that case, make that connection between the climate policy outcomes and broader societal goals, I think is one way to bring this to the British public space. I'm actually from Australia, and I find it difficult to think about how to interact with the British public space. I mean, we've had our own political challenges with climate change as a ridiculously divisive political football in Australia. But I think some exchanges with campaigners and think tanks and groups in Australia who've come through the other side of this this political debate would really help us as well in the UK.
Fiona, do you want a final comment?
I think you've unmuted me. Yeah, I mean, I think this has got to be positive. You know, I mean, having a planet that is livable, having a planet that, you know, our children can enjoy a stable climate in, having a planet where the air is breathable, where, you know, where you can walk or get public transport or cycle to places instead of always having to jump in your car. You know, all of having rivers that aren't full of sewage, you know, all of these are nice things. They're positive things. They're good things, and they're things that people respond to. People respond as well to the natural world and so on. So there's a really positive story to tell here, and I think that you've got to frame it in that positive way and show that these people who are anti-net zero, who don't want to go low carbon, who do want to have our rivers full of sewage, who, you know, who don't care about the decimation of our wildlife, and who are willing to kind of see us all plunge into you know, 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees beyond. We expose them for what they are. That's a death cult. Let's be, you know, let's talk about life. Let's talk about things that are positive and good and life enhancing and actually make life worth living and make life possible. In fact, that's how it needs to be framed. It's saving the planet's actually a positive thing.
On that wonderfully positive note, that is a great way to end. Exactly how I was hoping it would end. And I just want to thank all of our panel, Sarah, Alex, and Fiona. Really wonderful contributions from you all. So thank you so much for giving us your time, and thank you everybody for showing up on this Monday before Christmas. Really appreciate it.